The neckbeard. It's one of the boldest facial statements a man can make. Few are brave enough to feel winter's touch upon their lips while warming their throat in a follicle jungle. Nature's necktie is dashing, it's provocative, but it's oh so often maligned. And while these days the neckbeard is the calling card of basement gremlins and Reddit moderators, 'twas not always so. For today, we celebrate the greatest of the great, men whose bare faces and furry necks were the envy of the world. So, there's only one thing left to do before we begin. Welcome to the greatest neckbeards in history. So straight off the bat, here is a man with a handsome neckbeard. It might not be pushing the boundaries, but it's a respectable spread of throat fluff. So who is this and why is he here? Well, he is arguably the most tragic figure on this list. For Ptolemy VI was the last king of Egypt, albeit a Greek one, when ancient Egypt could still be called a great power. Ptolemy VI's father had been killed in a botched invasion attempt of their eastern neighbors, another successor state of Alexander's empire called the Seleucids. As a result, the Ptolemies lost their precious land and ports in Syria, but there wasn't much Ptolemy VI could do about it, as he was only 6 years old at the time. So the hapless Ptolemy could only look on through his childhood as a team of parvenus ran the country. In due course, Ptolemy's handlers decided to try and recapture Egypt's lost territories in Syria, but their invasion was a catastrophe. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV slaughtered the Ptolemaic army near the border fort of Pelusium, leaving Egypt as exposed as a hairless neck. So the Seleucids came thundering into the Nile Valley, staying for years until Antiochus made a fatal error. He tried to have himself crowned as pharaoh. This ambition woke a slumbering beast who so far had been watching from the sidelines with hungry, poison eyes. I'm talking about the Roman Republic. What happened next was a crushing embarrassment for the Seleucids. For an envoy from the Roman Senate approached Antiochus's camp, but as Antiochus raised his hand to greet the envoy, the Romans snubbed him. The Senate's demands were clear. Antiochus had to leave Egypt. The Roman envoy calmly took a stick and drew a circle in the sand around the Seleucid king. Antiochus was ordered to make a decision on whether to comply with the Senate's demands before he left that circle. So Antiochus did decide, and when he left that circle in the sand, his path headed east, out of Egypt with his tail between his legs. Ptolemy may have breathed a sigh of relief, but the shadow of Rome was looming large over his kingdom. In fact, over the entire Mediterranean. The rest of his reign was marred by vicious indigenous rebellions, as well as the coups and connivances of his brother Ptolemy Psychon, nicknamed Fatty. But towards the end of his rule, it really seemed like his troubles might subside. He had recaptured Upper Nubia in modern Sudan, which gave him access to crucial gold mines and populations of elephants which he could replenish his armies with. This provided the boost that Ptolemy needed to look east again and take the fight to the hated Seleucids. He first disrupted his foes by supporting different claimants to their throne, before finally invading Syria in 147 BC. His invasion was a triumph. He reclaimed the Ptolemies' lost lands there and even captured the Seleucid capital of Antioch. And then, in his moment of glory as his forces smashed the Seleucids on the battlefield to cement final victory and control over Syria, Ptolemy VI was violently thrown from his horse. Dazed and clearly unwell, Ptolemy VI was led from the site of his final victory, neck curtains billowing like the curtains of the palanquin they carried him in. 3 days later, in the city of Antioch, a long way from his home on the gentle Nile, Ptolemy VI died of his wounds. But in the golden images of his bristly neck, we see the promise of his life. How tantalizing his final victory, and how, if he hadn't been born into such chaos, he could have perhaps been a better king. A worthy 5th place. Now, Camillo Benso, the Count of Cavour, may appear to us as the archetype of the Reddit moderator, his striped esophagus so gracefully embraced by the folds of a double chin. But he, the Prime Minister of the small North Italian kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, was a political mastermind. He represents the neckbeard as the wonk, the strategist, the geek. More than any other on this list, Cavour possessed the cunning of a ranked League of Legends or professional Total War player. Well known in his home country of Italy, he arguably deserves more credit than anyone else for turning that peninsula from a patchwork of tiny scattered states into a single unified nation. What stands out about him is his remarkable ability to pull off diplomatic and political gambles. The gambling began with the Crimean War. At this point in the 1850s, the Austrian Habsburg Empire dominated Italy. Cavour knew that to loosen their stranglehold, he would have to gain the support of one of the great powers. That meant currying favour with France or Britain, and as those two powers went to war with Russia, Cavour sniffed out an opportunity. So he sent Piedmontese troops to the front lines, where they gallantly fought the forces of the Tsar. Over 2,000 Italians died in the fighting, and this made an impression on certain bigwigs in Paris and London. After all, the Piedmontese had sacrificed more than the Austrians, who had mobilized against Russia but spent the duration of the war skulking behind their border. Soon Cavour honed in on France and Napoleon III as their most promising ally, for the emperor was a former revolutionary sympathetic to some liberal causes like Italian nationalism. Cavour began a game of cat and mouse with Austria, mobilizing Piedmontese troops along the border and trying to bait the Habsburgs into starting a war. So he couldn't believe his luck when Austria sent him an ultimatum, demanding Piedmont disarm on pain of invasion. When the deadline passed, Austria attacked. But good to his word, in came pouring Napoleon III and the French armies to bolster Piedmont's small force. When the dust had settled, Austria had been defeated and most of north and central Italy had been granted to Piedmont Sardinia. But Napoleon's support had come at a cost. Savoy and Nizza, now the city of Nice, were ceded to France. And the other giant of Italian unification, Nice-born swashbuckler Giuseppe Garibaldi, was furious. But his feud with Cavour would not last long, because he and his troops were soon deployed to the south of Italy. By 1861, the entire Italian peninsula, with the exception of Rome and Venice, was part of the new Kingdom of Italy. Cavour's masterful diplomacy had turned a tiny kingdom into a sizable player. By the end of the century, Italy would be considered one of the world's great powers and would even have a colonial empire in Africa. It was his wonkish knowledge and relentless energy that made Cavour a consummate politician. Someone who through pure skill made a small country great. He saw the big picture, gambled and won, and died a highly celebrated figure and a national hero. Truly, a Goliath of the neckbearding world. A crucial aspect of the neck-bearded gentleman is his status as a lone wolf. Someone who rejects the conventions of society. For it must be said that society at large does not always look kindly upon their choice of facial hair. The neckbeard must therefore be self-reliant, unconcerned with the opinions of others, and capable of ordering his own Doritos and Mountain Dew online before his mother brings them down to his basement. This rugged individualism is best expressed by the third person on our list, the American writer, philosopher, and outdoorsman Henry David Thoreau. I will admit that I approached researching Thoreau with a dose of skepticism. I knew he advocated for a simpler life and a return to nature, but that seemed to me like it could be cheaply romantic, even antisocial. But reading his 1854 book Walden about the time he spent living near a lake near the town of Concord in Massachusetts really changed my mind. Here was a man whose bushy neck not only represented a critique of society, but the possibility of finding an organic and balanced way of life. So what did he believe? Well, Thoreau's ideal was a life reduced to its bare essentials. He saw the chasing of baubles and luxuries rampant in consumer societies as an expression of spiritual poverty. For one who is satisfied with what they have needn't always grasp after more. A few warm clothes, a sturdy house, food, and quiet, this is all one really needs, as Thoreau could observe in the lives of Native Americans. But he also noticed how so many people live lives they haven't chosen, stuck in inherited farms and businesses, pleasing the expectations of others rather than embodying their own virtues, trapped on hamster wheels and never realizing that they're free to leave. The 12 labours of Hercules were trifling in comparison with those which my neighbours have undertaken, for they were only 12 and had an end. What I admire about Thoreau is that his wisdom isn't derived from sneering at the civilized world, but from a genuine, humane love of simplicity. He's highly quotable as well. For example, the phrase, "Men have become the tools of their tools," seems more relevant than ever. His careful descriptions of nature remind us vividly how intricate, bustling, serene, and altogether amazing this world we live in is. if only we pay attention. In one scene, he describes a war between red and black ants fought over a log pile. And I was stunned because it brought my own memories flooding back. I was a spectator to this exact thing one summer as a child on the patio of my family house. I watched legions of amber and jet insects wrestling and biting and tearing each other apart in the cracks and crevices of this flooring. And his words brought all of that nostalgia alive with his descriptions of these tiny insects. And the dark carbuncles on the sufferer's eyes shone with ferocity, such as war could only excite. American accents are it's not brilliant. Thoreau's wisdom, his love of liberty and hatred of cruelty and slavery found its expression in many of the giant figures he influenced, like Leo Tolstoy, Mohandas Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. To that grand list of admirers, I'll add myself. For his flowing whiskers and determined self-expression, Thoreau embodies the neckbeard ideal like few others. But if we ever feel nostalgic for the past, for the golden age of neckbeards when things didn't seem so trivial, Thoreau has some choice words for us. Some are dinning in our ears that we Americans and moderns generally are intellectual dwarfs compared with the ancients or even the Elizabethan men. But what is that to the purpose? A living dog is better than a dead lion. Shall a man go and hang himself because he belongs to the race of pygmies and not be the biggest pygmy that he can? A worthy bronze medalist. At number 2 is arguably the most famous person on this list, certainly the most notorious, someone with an extraordinarily lurid reputation. Indeed, he was so reviled by some that he appears as the Beast, a monster of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. What could this mean? Well, there is an interpretive system in Judaism where letters of the Hebrew alphabet are assigned numerical values, and it's called gematria. And 666, or 616 as it's written in some early manuscripts, can only refer to one person's name. Neron Caesar. This is, of course, the Roman Emperor Nero, who to Christians became a personification of pure evil. But Nero was not just this. He was an artist, a lover of all things flamboyant like music, theatre, athletics, and chariot racing. He even competed in the Olympic Games riding a ridiculous 10-horse chariot, and even though he fell out of the cart, he was still crowned victor of the race. You can see his artistic sensibilities printed on his neckbeard. Very well defined, a classic helmet strap with some Roman curls weaved in. It would have looked quite something in Nero's strawberry blonde hair tie. But the emperor's performative nature was despised by Roman aristocrats whose austere morality condemned performers as degenerate, barely better than slaves or prostitutes. That is why, above all, Nero shows us the neckbeard as the maverick and the provocateur, someone who could rage bait you in some dank corner of Reddit. But he also proves why theatre kids should never be given power. For there are a chorus of texts which claim that Nero was a singularly cruel man. As a young emperor, he seemed promising, a descendant of the incomparable Caesar Augustus, stewarded by a formidable mother and tutored by one of the greatest Stoic philosophers of all time, Seneca. But even with access to the purest wisdom, a ripening mind can rot. As Nero matured, he chafed under these authority figures, and his plots to rid himself of them grew murderous. He allegedly tried to kill his mother by sabotaging a boat she was taking a trip on. So imagine his shock when he saw the boat sink and then saw his mother rock up on the beach having swum back to shore. But no compassion nor shame prevented the emperor from getting his bodyguards to stab her to death right there on the beach. Later rumor had it that Nero killed his second wife by kicking her in the abdomen, although in truth she may have just died during childbirth. He certainly seemed to have mourned her, although many destructive people have later tearfully regretted their actions. Indeed, he subsequently procured for himself a young slave boy called Sporus, who allegedly looked exactly like his late wife. He had him castrated, forced him to dress as her, and even called him by his wife's name. But when Rome was ravaged by a giant fire late in the emperor's reign, Nero's immediate instinct was to find a scapegoat. He landed on a strange new cult out of Judea. Soon, hundreds of tortured Christians burned around the city of Rome, as the delighted emperor rode his chariot past these hellish pyres. Who could blame Seneca then if he did join a plot to oust his failed protege who had made a mockery of all of the virtues Seneca had tried to impart? But the plot was undone, and Seneca, protesting his innocence, was forced to commit suicide. This was the fate that in due course Nero himself would suffer, for his levying of higher taxes to rebuild Rome prompted a series of revolts that toppled his rule. But this mad swirl of violence around Nero, can it really be true? We know most of the sources about him were written by aristocrats hostile to his flamboyant form of populism. He was evidently a beloved ruler in some quarters, particularly the eastern parts of the empire. He even inspired the myth of Nero Redivivus, a belief that Nero would rise again, and this was still popular in the 5th century AD. You can't get immortalized like a Roman King Arthur and not have had some supporters. But in his extremes of cruelty and camp, Nero remains above all else an enormously glamorous figure. His feathered larynx, a rebuke to Roman traditions, symbolizes his life's mischief, and he is surely one of the greatest neckbeards to ever tread the face of this earth. Now, in the top spot, we have a man who may be unknown to most of you, who was certainly unknown to me until very recently. But no other neck-bearded gentleman I have encountered in my research has so shocked and delighted me. And no other neckbeard has so inhabited every nuance of the archetype. For when we think of neckbeards, we think, yes, of the maverick, the tragic, and the geeky. But we also think of limited personal hygiene. And this man ticked every box. Let me introduce you to Jack Black. No, not that Jack Black, but my God, do I want to see Jack Black play Jack Black in a movie. This Jack Black lived in London in the 1840s, and a more shockingly authentic and comically grotesque character could not have been invented by Charles Dickens. For Jack Black was the royal rat catcher and mole destroyer. The Victorian journalist Henry Mayhew wrote up an incredible interview he conducted with Mr. Black in his ramshackle zoo of a house in Battersea, London. I call it a zoo because the place was teeming with caged animals: ferrets, dogs, rats, birds, fish. The ferrets and the dogs were trained for rat hunting, but these were far from the most exotic animals he ever trained for that sport. Indeed, Black had tried to train raccoons to hunt rats, he tried to train a monkey to hunt rats, but best of all was Polly, a badger, who was a rat killer extraordinaire and even won herself a 100 match. That's right, we actually know who would win in a fight between a badger and 100 rats. In an illustration, we see how Mr. Black looked. Top hat, coat, and a gloriously bushy neck muffler. Note the large belt he wears across his chest like a sash, studded with metal rats. These he made by melting down his wife's saucepans and fitting them into molds made from the dead critters. And missing saucepans wasn't the only thing that Mrs. Black had to put up with. In fact, her husband confided to Mayhew that he had actually eaten rats without her knowledge. Apparently, they were as moist as rabbits and quite as nice. So who was the royal rat catcher, and how was it that he could so magically handle wild rodents as if they were so many blind kittens? He started off catching rats for fun, age 9, but soon noticed that gentlemen and ladies would take a great interest in watching it. He soon managed to turn his innate talent into a job. Part of what I love about his story as someone who lives in London is what it says about that great city and its many familiar place names in the early Victorian period. We see a monster metropolis, the biggest in the world. Market men hawking wares from their carts, urchins and chimney sweeps, prostitutes and fisherwives, moving in a tumult of activity underneath dark plumes of industrial smoke. And in the midst of these carnivals of commerce and clip-clopping carriages, millions and millions of rats. But rat catching was a dangerous business indeed in a time before modern medicine, even knowledge of bacteria. I've been dead near 3 times from bites. I've been bitten nearly everywhere, even where I can't name to you, sir. But as a child, Black wasn't put off by the bites, and soon he turned his prodigal skills into performance art. He would tow a cart around and perform, stuffing rats under his shirt, letting them run all over him for the enjoyment of the crowds. But if you aren't horrified already, some of Black's stories are truly nightmarish. Take one job where the rats gnawed the hands and feet of the little children. The lady heard them crying and got out of her bed and called to the servant to know what the child was making such a noise for, when they struck a light, and then they see the rats running away to the holes. Their little nightgowns was covered with blood, as if their throats had been cut. Mr. Black called birds and fish too. He was known as the Battersea otter, as well as beetles and moles who have got a mouth exactly like a shark and teeth like saws. A wonderful saw mouth. But for all the shocking violence of his life, Jack Black supposedly had an expression of kindliness in his countenance. And it is partly to him to which we owe the so-called fancy rats of today, the domestic little guys who I hear make great pets. So while he killed countless rats, he also bred them into friends. I find there are strange parallels between rats and people. Wherever we have gone, we have taken rats with us. And there's a strange resonance to me in thinking about both the rodents and the residents of London, both then and now, all labouring under the same sun, all running their own rat races. So I don't delight in stories of cruelty to these animals for their own sake. But for me, the story of Jack Black is so wonderful because it captures everything best about studying history. To see your own city, your own country or culture reflected back at you, some of it eerily familiar and some of it just unrecognisable. In Jack Black, we see this kind of entrepreneurial London geezer of a type that still exists, but in this alien slum of a megacity. But we can recognise that Black was a maverick who made an art form out of his grim profession. He was an individualist who rejected the opinions of polite society with his rat-scarred hands. He was an animal geek, a master handler, tamer, and killer. And he was a tragic figure whose impoverished society forced him into an inherently cruel and dirty trade. He is therefore, in my opinion, the master neckbeard, one who brooks no equal, and he became so through his own bold choices. Thus concludes our epic saga through neckbeardom. If you made it this far, please consider liking, commenting who your favourite was, and subscribing to the channel. But as we look back, reflecting on the giants of this list, I feel the mantle of the neckbeard growing too heavy to handle. In fact, I'm in the mood for a shave. Thanks for watching.